Russia thought it had solved the tank problem. Spot it, drone it, film it, post it with music. And for a while that worked. The Abrams arrived with a reputation the size of Texas, took losses, and the internet declared American armor finished in Ukraine. That was premature. Because the story out of Ukraine is not that the Abrams failed. It is that Ukraine figured out something Russia genuinely did not expect, and started using the most famous tank in the world in a way nobody saw coming. And unlike a lot of armies that take 5 years, 3 committees, and 1 PowerPoint addiction to adapt to reality, Ukraine did something much more dangerous. It learned. That is the part Russia hates most. Not the tank, not the turbine, not the optics. The part that should worry Moscow is that Ukraine stopped treating the Abrams like a glorious Hollywood battering ram and started using it like a very angry piece of a much larger murder machine. That is a very different problem. Because once you stop expecting the Abrams to win the battle alone, you start seeing what it is actually doing. It is not charging across empty ground looking for a parade route. It is surviving inside a system, showing up after the route has been mapped, after drones have identified firing points, after artillery has softened the sector, after infantry is ready to move, and right when Russian troops are having the worst few minutes of their week. Late in 2025, around Pokrovsk, footage started circulating that captured the real Abrams story. Not the old fantasy where one tank flattens an entire front while everybody claps. What you actually see is something nastier and smarter. A Ukrainian assault forms up under cover. Drones are already in the air. A mine-clearing vehicle leads. The Abrams is there not to cosplay Patton, but to punch open just enough space for everybody else to work. That distinction matters, because Russia's war machine is built around a brutal little equation. Spot, fix, strike, repeat. Find movement with drones, pin it with fire, finish it with FPVs, artillery, or mines. Simple, cheap, effective. Very Russian, in the sense that it works best when life is cheap and the repair bill belongs to somebody else. The Abrams also started appearing with extra protection. Cages, screens, added armor, improvised anti-drone measures. None of it makes the vehicle invincible. Nothing does in this war. If anything claims to be invincible in Ukraine, it is either propaganda or a warehouse manager trying to hit quota. What those modifications do is buy seconds. And in this war, a few ugly extra seconds can decide whether a machine dies uselessly or earns its keep. That brings us to Pokrovsk. If you want one place that explains why the Abrams still matters, this is it. It is one of those urban industrial fights where terrain starts behaving like a weapon. Warehouses, basements, rail lines, concrete shells, half-destroyed industrial compounds, dead ground between buildings. This kind of place lets defenders hide, regroup, and keep biting at anyone trying to move through it. Once you grip industrial terrain, you gain cover, drone positions, protected infantry routes, and a base for pressing deeper. Not glamorous, just strategically nasty. So when Ukrainian forces move to hold or retake a sector like that, they are not doing it for symbolism. They are doing it because if they lose that ground, the next fight gets worse. That is the context people miss when they look at the Pokrovsk footage and just see another tank. What you are really watching is a race for useful terrain. And just before one of those Ukrainian assaults, Russian forces had already tried to crack the same area. They pushed columns along exposed routes, moved troops in a way that suggested they still believed mass could solve precision, and got punished hard for it. Drones swarmed the approach, artillery joined in, vehicles were hit, troops bailed into miserable scraps of cover. What followed looked less like an offensive and more like a refund request from the afterlife. That matters for 2 reasons. 1, it tells you the sector was hot enough that both sides were willing to spend real assets on it. 2, it shows Ukraine did not just throw the Abrams into random chaos and hope for the best. The battlefield had already been studied. The Russian pattern had already been observed. When the Ukrainians then send in an assault group with a mine-clearing vehicle, armored carriers, infantry, drones overhead, and an Abrams placed deliberately in the formation, that is not recklessness. That is a calculated decision made after preparation. That is not glamorous tank warfare. That is effective tank warfare. And it comes with a grim little irony. For years, Russia loved presenting itself as the king of deep battle, armor, maneuver, mass, operational art, all the grand language. Then the actual war turned into a place where Ukrainian units started using a Western tank with more imagination than many Russian formations use with an entire battalion. Somewhere in Moscow, a Soviet ghost definitely lit a cigarette over that one. The Russian side then does what Russian forces always do once the noise starts. Drones go up, surviving infantry shift, firing points wake up, and the battlefield tries to close its jaws. At that moment, a tank crew either panics, stalls, or keeps doing the job. This is where the Abrams earns the respect it still has. Even after taking hits, what stands out is not magical immunity. It is the fact that the vehicle keeps functioning inside appalling conditions long enough to matter. Crews survive, fire continues, infantry finishes the task. A machine that gives your men one more block. One more strong point, one more chance to get home is not obsolete. It is valuable and the only currency this war truly respects. Useful violence. And that creates a problem for Russia that goes beyond one tank or one assault. Because if Ukraine has figured out how to keep the Abrams relevant in the ugliest combat environment on Earth, the tank is no longer a prestige symbol. It becomes a repeatable battlefield tool. And once it becomes repeatable, Russia has to keep spending drones, mines, artillery, and manpower to answer it. That is where obliterating the war machine starts making sense. Not because one Abrams is flattening the Russian army like a video game boss, but because every successful adapted assault forces Russia into another expensive defensive reaction. More drones burned, more ambushes exposed, more infantry pinned, more equipment lost trying to hold terrain that suddenly became much harder to hold. The Abrams is not winning by being invulnerable. It is winning by making Russia pay. And the really humiliating part for Moscow is that this is happening with a tank most people had already written off. Russia would have preferred the Abrams to become a museum exhibit with a turbine. Something dramatic, expensive, and irrelevant. Instead, it turned into something much more annoying. A survivor. And survivors are hard to propagandize away. Footage of a disabled tank is one thing. Footage of an assault that still works. Infantry that still gets in. Positions that still get cleared. And crews that still get out alive tells a much nastier story. It tells you the system is adapting, and once the system adapts, the next question becomes far more dangerous for Russia. What happens when there are more of them? That question stopped being theoretical the moment more Abrams started re-entering the conversation. Because one of the laziest assumptions floating around this war is that once a weapon takes losses, it somehow exits history. As if the battlefield sends a polite email. Everybody agrees the experiment is over, and the surviving vehicles retire to a barn somewhere to think about what they've done. That is not how Ukraine fights. If a weapon still offers battlefield value, Ukraine keeps squeezing value out of it, hard, sometimes elegantly, sometimes with the kind of field modification that looks like it was designed by three angry mechanics, one welding torch, in pure national spite. Either way, if it can still save lives and ruin somebody else's day, it stays in the game. The Abrams is dangerous in Ukraine for the same reason a chainsaw is dangerous in a horror movie. Not because it solves every problem, but because once it appears in the right setting, everybody nearby starts making terrible calculations under pressure. Used badly, it is a target. Used properly, it becomes a moving anchor for violence. That difference comes down to Doctrine. The early fantasy was always too simple. Drop the tank on the battlefield, point it east, cue dramatic music, and wait for the Russian line to collapse into a pile of burning conscripts and poor procurement decisions. That was never serious analysis. That was wishful thinking wearing camouflage. What Ukraine actually did is much colder. It turned the Abrams into a conditional weapon. Only move it when the route has been studied. Only commit it when infantry can exploit what it opens. Only keep it in place as long as the gain outweighs the drone risk. And the moment the equation changes, pull the crew out and preserve the one thing that cannot be replaced with foreign aid. Experience. Everybody loves counting metal. Almost nobody counts human capital properly. A tank can be damaged, abandoned, turned into a smoking meme for Russian channels. A trained crew with battlefield experience around Pokrovsk cannot be mass-produced in a warehouse outside Pittsburgh and shipped over by Tuesday. Russia loves filming dead hardware. Ukraine is trying to keep alive the men who know how to fight from it. Those are not the same philosophy. Only one of them scales, and that is where the Russian war machine starts taking damage in a way that does not show up cleanly in one dramatic clip. Because Russia's system relies on volume. Drones, shells, cheap strike options, pressure, and human beings push through a tree line with roughly the same regard a Soviet warehouse manager once gave to forklift safety. That system works best against targets that are predictable. A tank parked stupidly, a column moving without shaping fire, a headquarters still pretending the drone revolution is a phase. But when Ukraine keeps changing the sequence, the cost curve shifts. Russian drone teams have to search harder. Artillery gets called onto a fight that has already moved. A defensive position starts taking direct fire while infantry slips in from a different angle. Mines get breached instead of dictating the pace. And one armored vehicle stops being the whole attack and becomes the visible center of something coordinated by a wider kill web. That is the phrase people should be paying attention to. Kill web, not tank charge, not armored thrust, not cavalry spirit with diesel fumes. Kill web. The Abrams matters because it sits inside that web. Drones feed awareness. Recon shapes the route. Engineers reduce the mobility trap. Infantry clears what armor cannot hold. Artillery suppresses whatever tries to regroup. Then the Abrams delivers shock exactly where it is most useful, not where tradition says a tank is supposed to look heroic. And once Russian troops know the Abrams is not arriving alone, the psychological effect changes entirely. You are no longer hearing a turbine and thinking, there's a tank. You are hearing a turbine and wondering how many drones are already above you, whether the road was mined well enough, whether the building next door is about to be breached, and whether your commander has once again confused bravery with sending you into an unwinnable mess. That doubt kills tempo. A position does not need to be destroyed in one cinematic instant to be neutralized. Sometimes hesitation is enough. A late move, a gunner who keeps staring at the tank while the actual danger moves along the wall to his left. The Abrams helps create that confusion, and confusion is lethal when Ukraine's assault package is built to exploit it. There is one more reason this tank remains relevant that does not get talked about enough. The Abrams is a crew machine. One side treats the tank as part of a trained, networked combat team. The other still has recurring moments where vehicles feel like armored taxis for men told to drive into hell and improvise once they arrive. That is not a hardware gap. That is a culture gap. Professional violence tends to beat theatrical violence over time. Russia learned too. Expanded FPV use. Layered reconnaissance. Got much better at hunting armor than many expected. Anybody pretending otherwise is doing propaganda, not analysis. But adaptation is not ownership. Russia adapted to kill tanks more efficiently. Ukraine adapted to use tanks more intelligently. Those are two different races. Ukraine does not need the Abrams to dominate every kilometer. It only needs it doing high-value work at decisive moments. Support an assault here. Break a fortified pocket there. Force Russia to commit more resources than it wanted to in one narrow sector. That is already enough to matter. This is why the late 2025 footage mattered. Not because it proved the Abrams is invincible. It proved the Abrams is usable. And that is far more important. Invincibility is fantasy. Usability wins wars. The obituary for tanks in Ukraine was written much too early by people who confused tactical vulnerability with strategic irrelevance. The real question is never, can this be killed? It is, can this still create more problems for the enemy than the enemy creates for it? For the Abrams, in the right conditions, the answer is still yes. Australia's contribution reinforced that. Western-backed armor is being sustained, rotated, learned, and reworked. Not perfectly, not endlessly, but enough to keep the Russian side from relaxing, and to collapse the hope that Abrams' losses alone would make the platform disappear. Out on the battlefield, the bill still arrives. In dead infantry around a road approach, in burned vehicles near an industrial zone, in drones and shells wasted on a tank that was really there to protect the men taking the actual actual objective. That is how war machines get worn down now, not by annihilation, by friction. And the Abrams, used correctly, produces a lot of friction. Enough to ruin assaults, crack defensive timing, keep one sector alive when Russia badly needed it to fold, and turn a supposedly obsolete vehicle into something Moscow still has to take very seriously, which is deeply embarrassing when you remember how much effort went into telling the world the Abrams had already been finished off by cheap drones and Russian genius. Russian genius, by the way, remains one of the greatest fictional franchises ever produced, right up there with honest used car salesmen and 2-week special military operations. The more dangerous question now is not whether the Abrams can still matter. It clearly can. The more dangerous question is what Ukraine does next. Because once a military learns how to make a vulnerable platform useful again, it starts refining, spreading lessons, combining more tools, choosing its moments with greater confidence. And that is when a battlefield adaptation becomes a doctrine shift. And in a war where Russia still burns through men and machines like both are on state discount, that may be the most devastating thing of all. Because a Russian war machine can survive bad equipment. It can survive ugly losses. It can survive lies, cope, and another parade speech about inevitable victory. What it does not handle well is an enemy that keeps adapting faster than it can. That is where the Abrams becomes more than a tank. It becomes proof. Proof that Russia still has not solved the battlefield it created. And proof that every time Moscow thinks it has buried one more Ukrainian capability, something loud, expensive, and extremely unfriendly comes back out of the smoke. And somewhere out there, a Russian drone operator is probably staring at another Abrams through a fuzzy screen, thinking, I thought we already killed this thing. Yeah, that is the problem.